It's NBA trade season, so it's only fitting that with all the great trades we hope to see, we remind ourselves of all the terrible ones that are possible at any given moment, with the worst trade from every NBA team in the last 10 years. First with the Heat, who back in 2015 traded Norris Cole, Justin Hamilton, Sean Williams, Danny Granger, and 2 first-round picks for Goran and Zoran Dragic. And honestly, this one's not even that bad. The idea of 4 players and 2 first-round picks for basically only Goran Dragic does sound rough, but when you consider the fact that none of these 4 guys lasted more than 2 years in the NBA after the Heat traded them, makes things a little better. And when you consider how much Goran did for the Heat in his time there, basically 2 first-round picks for him might have been a little much, but it wasn't really that bad. On the other hand, in the 2014 draft, the Chicago Bulls traded 2 of their first-round picks for Doug McDermott, and that's rough. They desperately wanted a shooter to pair with their core of Derrick Rose, Jimmy Butler, Taj Gibson, and Joakim Noah, so they traded their 16th and 19th draft picks to the Nuggets that year so they could move up and get Doug, who was one of the best players in college basketball that season. At the time, it sounded like a good move, but considering the fact that Doug only averaged 8 points a game for the Bulls, and the Nuggets used their picks on Yusuf Nurkic and Gary Harris, it kinda hurts. But it hurts even more to know that they later traded McDermott, Taj Gibson, and a 2nd round pick that would turn out to be Mitchell Robinson to the Thunder for PAYNE, Anthony MURROW, and Joffrey LAUVERGNE. So they lost out on another solid pick just trying to get rid of him. With the Suns, Goran Dragic comes up again when in 2011 they trade Goran Dragic and a 1st round pick for Aaron Brooks, who was out of the NBA for a season after only 25 games for them. So they lost out on the eventual better player and a draft pick, but I don't know what's worse, that or the fact that they traded Isaiah Thomas in 2015 for Marcus Thornton in a first, the season before he started getting MVP votes. Phoenix had a lot of shots with point guards, but fumbled all of them for years, before the whole Chris Paul thing happened. For the Pacers, we all know how that goes. They traded Kawhi Leonard and Davis Bertans to the Spurs for George Hill, while the Warriors clearly haven't made many mistakes this decade when it comes to trades. So it made it pretty tough to find one, and I barely could, so the only one was that the Timberwolves originally drafted Andre Roberson, and Golden State originally traded to get him, but traded him right after to the OKC Thunder for Archie Goodwin, which in the grand scheme of things really isn't that big of a deal. For the Knicks, their worst trade was trading Kristaps Porzingis, Tim Hardaway Jr., and Trey Burke to Dallas for DeAndre Jordan, Wes Matthews, Dennis Smith Jr., and 2 first-round picks. Now at the time, this wasn't as terrible. Dennis Smith still had potential as a young player, and he was the main piece of this trade, so him and 2 first-round picks was okay. But also at the time, Kristaps Porzingis was looking like he was on his way to stardom, and he said he had a slight problem with the team, so Phil Jackson just traded him right away instead of trying to solve the problem at all. And it makes it that much worse that DeAndre and Wes weren't good players afterwards. Smith Jr. was garbage, and they haven't gotten anyone notable from those first-round picks. One of the worst managed teams in all of the NBA is the Orlando Magic, and I'll never understand this one. Victor Oladipo, Domantas Sabonis, and Ersan Ilyasova for SERGE IBAKA. Oladipo was 23 and putting up 16, 4, and 4. Sabonis hadn't even played a game yet, and Ibaka was 26. We had already seen all we were going to see from Serge. Before the trade, Orlando already had 3 other big men on the roster, and now they had 4, with Evan Fournier as their only main guard. And it serves them right that Serge only played there 56 games before getting traded again the next season for Terrence Ross and a 1st-round pick. The Mavericks made a mistake of their own in 2014 when they traded Jay Crowder, Jameer Nelson, Brandon Wright, and a 1st-round pick for Rajon Rondo and Dwight Powell. Dallas was going for a point guard and thinking they were getting the best player in this trade, but little did they know they just lost 3 players and a pick for a player who would never be that same Celtics star again and would create problems for them, arguing with Rick Carlisle and flat out refusing to play in the playoffs, so he was straight up let go after the season. Even at the time though, this one was still questionable because he was only putting up 8 and 8 this season before the trade. The Atlanta Hawks have been hitting on all cylinders recently in terms of drafting and acquiring players, but in 2018 they did draft Devontae Graham, but traded him for a 2nd round pick. Then 2 seasons later, Devontae goes and averages 18 and 7. He would have been a great backup for Trae Young, and what makes it hurt even more is that 2nd round pick turned out to be Bol, but they traded that pick for cash before he was actually drafted. It's hard to believe the Bucks are at where they are today, given what they were doing 10 years ago. Like in 2013, their team was led by Brandon Jennings and Monte Ellis, and they actually thought they could compete, so they tried bringing in JJ Redick to help, and to do so they traded their 20-year-old rookie in Tobias Harris. Well, right after the trade, Tobias averaged 17 and 8 for the Magic to finish out that season, while JJ had the worst shooting season of his career and played only 28 games for Milwaukee. The Thunder's worst trade will always be the one for James Harden, and no more needs to be said. I had to really search for one for the Jazz though, and all I could find was the fact that they traded Thomas Bryant and Josh Hart to the Lakers for Tony Bradley in 2017, but they can get a pass for that. As for the Pelicans, they vetoed the Chris Paul trade traded to the Lakers in 2011, then came back with the hot garbage of himself for Eric Gordon, Chris Kaman, Al-Farouq Aminu, and a first round pick that turned into Austin Rivers. Gordon had his best season in 2011 right before the trade. Chris Kaman only stayed in New Orleans for a season, and Aminu and Rivers didn't amount to much. And this was all for the clear best point guard in the league at the time. Now the Los Angeles Lakers have two. The first is obvious, Russell Westbrook for a young Kyle Kuzma, reigning 6th man of the year MONTREZL, KCP, and Isaiah Jackson. And let's keep in mind, Westbrook and his $40 million a year were thought of as untradeable before this. I mean, he had just gotten traded in a 1-for-1 deal for John Wall, who really was untradeable. So it made no sense and still doesn't, seeing how he's played. Then the other for LA was the fact that they traded the Suns 2 first-round picks and 2 second-round picks for Steve Nash in 2012. And that turned out to be a disaster, full of below-average play and injuries. Back in 2015, in desperate need of cap space, the Kings were finding a way to clear up some, so they traded Nick Stauskas, Carl Landry, and Jason Thompson for 2 nobodies to the 76ers. But the bad part is they had to trade a first and 2 first-round pick swaps to get it done, and that's rough. The Jimmy Butler situation was also rough for the Minnesota Timberwolves. Everything about it was terrible. They traded 2 of their young up-and-coming stars to get him. It was a disaster while he was there, then getting only Robert Covington, Dario Saric, and Jared Bayless in return for him made it even worse. Meaning in one season they turned Zach LaVine and Lauri Markkanen into these 3 guys. As for the Houston Rockets, well, they had a young Kyle Lowry for a few years and they didn't see much in him. It also didn't help that he didn't perform his best while he was there. But it just hurts more to see him get traded for Gary Forbes and a first round pick, and then see him go to the Raptors to be one of their biggest franchise players over the next 10 years, become a multiple time All-Star, and help them win a championship. The worst trade for the Spurs was obviously trading Kawhi Leonard and Danny Green for DeMar DeRozan, Jakob Poeltl, and a first round pick. Kawhi Leonard was unhappy, but even with that, it didn't make this trade any better, and to see the Raptors win the title the very next year because of it had to have hurt that much more. Back in 2011, the Boston Celtics were still a real threat in the Eastern Conference, but that year they traded Kendrick Perkins and Nate Robinson to the Thunder for Jeff Green, Nanan Kristic, and a first round pick. And on paper, this was a great move by Boston. They got the younger and better player at the time who had more potential, but the Celtics were never really the same after this. Sure, they were already aging, but when asked about the trade, Paul Pierce said, "To me, chemistry is everything. It doesn't matter what type of talent you bring in or what type of talent you have on your ball club. People underrate what chemistry brings." So he really felt that them trading Perkins and Nate ruined the team's chemistry. When a player forces a trade and openly admits that they want to be traded, it puts their team in a bad spot. It usually forces them to speed up the process of finding them a trade, and that's what happened to the Cavs with Kyrie Irving. At the time, the trade was solid and they got near MVP Isaiah Thomas, Jay Crowder, and a first round pick, which did turn into Colin Sexton. But they didn't know Thomas's hip was as bad as it was, and maybe if they would have had more time, they would have figured that out. So realistically, they traded Irving for a couple of role players and a draft pick. For the Nets, we clearly know their worst trade. With the Clippers, I mentioned this one on a couple videos in the past, but it's still just so bad. They wanted to get rid of Baron Davis's bad contract, so they traded him and an unprotected pick to the Cavs for Mo Williams and Jamario Moon. But little did they know next season, that pick would turn out to be first overall, aka Kyrie Irving. The Denver Nuggets infamously traded Donovan Mitchell after drafting him to the Jazz for Trey Lyles and Tyler Lydon. And just imagine the big three they'd have if they had not made that mistake. While the Charlotte Hornets really don't make too many trades, it's why we have to go way back to 2010 to find one for them, when they traded Tyson Chandler and Alexis Ajinga to the Mavs for Matt Carroll, Eric Dampier, Eduardo Niera, and cash. At the time, Tyson was a real valuable asset and is what put the Mavericks over the hump for their championship, while in return the Hornets really got nobody. It's still questionable to me to this day why back in 2018 the Washington Wizards traded a young Kelly Oubre and Austin Rivers for Trevor Ariza. It's not like they were competitive at the time, and it's not like Ariza was going to put them over that hump. And of course, Oubre broke out soon after for the Suns. The 76ers made a bad trade in 2017 that still haunts them too, when they traded the number 3 pick and a first round pick for the number 1 spot to draft Markelle Fultz, while in return the Celtics just drafted Jason Tatum, and nothing else needs to be said. As for the Toronto Raptors, well, back in 2013 they traded Jose Calderon, Ed Davis, and a second round pick for Rudy Gay, and it was a solid move. They really didn't give up too much to get him, and they tried to bring in another star for their team, but ultimately alongside DeMar DeRozan there wasn't enough perimeter shooting and not enough touches for Kyle Lowry. It was a good attempt, but it just didn't work out, so it makes the list. The Detroit Pistons don't have a good history of great trades, but even they should have known trading Chris Middleton and Brandon Knight for Brandon Jennings just wasn't it. Brandon Jennings did nothing for them, and years later Chris is a championship winning multiple time all-star. With this and the Tobias Harris trade, it just seems like they're pretty impatient. For the Memphis Grizzlies, I'll never forget when they traded Rudy Gay straight up for John Lure, because they just couldn't afford to keep him. I get why they did it because of the situation, but keep better track of your money, Memphis. Then finally, Portland's had some bad trades, but none of them have left a worse taste in my mouth than when they recently traded Gary Trent Jr. for Norman Powell. I get they play different positions positions and they wanted a starter to help out instead of a guy off the bench, but they are and were averaging just about the same numbers and playing a pretty similar role on their teams. The only difference is Gary Trent is 5 years younger. They just could have done so much better with the trade for him. If you enjoyed the video, comment and let me know, and I'll catch you next time.